Iran just destroyed Israel's last functioning water treatment facility, not one of several, the last one. And what that means for 9 million people is not a military question anymore. It is a survival question. I'm going to break down exactly what happened, why Iran chose this specific weapon for this specific target, and what the clock that started running the moment those munitions hit actually means. Stay with me, because the implications of this strike go far beyond anything this conflict has produced so far. Let me be direct about something that most analysts are glossing over. There is a categorical difference between striking water infrastructure and striking the last water infrastructure. Every previous Iranian strike against Israel's water network degraded the system. This strike ended it. The Mekarat network, the interconnected backbone of Israel's civilian water supply, had already been systematically dismantled, node by node. What remained was a single facility carrying the entire load. 4 million people in Tel Aviv and the coastal communities, hospitals running on backup power, emergency distribution points that had become the only lifeline for a civilian population already living without functioning taps. All of it dependent on one plant continuing to operate. That plant is gone. And here is where the strategic calculation becomes precise and deliberate. Iran did not strike this facility with a standard ballistic warhead. It used cluster munitions. That choice was not incidental. It was the entire point. A ballistic warhead hits one location. It produces a crater, a blast radius, and structural damage that decreases as distance from the impact point increases. Against a large industrial facility, that means components within the blast radius are destroyed, and components outside it are damaged but potentially recoverable. That is exactly what happened with the earlier strikes on the Mekarat network. Facilities were hit, output was degraded, but partial operation continued because not every system in every facility was simultaneously destroyed. Engineers could work with what remained. Cluster munitions operate on an entirely different principle. A cluster munition disperses sub-munitions, individual explosive devices, across a defined target area. The result is not one large detonation. It is hundreds of simultaneous smaller detonations distributed across the entire facility footprint at once. The intake infrastructure is hit, the filtration systems are hit, the reverse osmosis membranes are hit, the chemical treatment systems are hit, the high-pressure distribution pumps are hit, the command and control systems coordinating every process stage are hit simultaneously. Every critical system in the facility absorbing individual detonation damage at the same moment. Iran did not create a repair problem with this strike, it created a replacement problem. And those two things are not the same. A repair problem means engineers identify what is broken, source replacement components, and restore function. It is a logistics and engineering challenge with a timeline attached to it. A replacement problem means the entire facility, every system, every component, every piece of specialized industrial equipment must be rebuilt from the ground up. That is not an engineering challenge on a crisis timeline. That is a multi-year reconstruction project. The last working water plant in Israel is not damaged. It is not partially operational. It is gone, and the distinction matters enormously for the 4 million people who needed it functioning this morning. But if you think the physical destruction of the facility is the worst part, stay with me. Because what comes next for the civilian population is where this situation becomes genuinely catastrophic. A water shortage is a manageable crisis. Supply is reduced below demand, rationing systems activate, emergency distribution supplements what the network can still deliver, and the gap between reduced supply and normal demand is managed through prioritization. Nations have frameworks for water shortages. International humanitarian organizations have pre-positioned responses. The gap is real, but it is a gap. Something exists on both sides of it. What Israel's civilian population is now facing is not a water shortage. It is a water absence. There is no supply to ration. There is no reduced output to supplement with emergency distribution. There is nothing. The only water that exists for 4 million people is what is currently sitting in pipes, in storage tanks, on supermarket shelves, and in whatever civil defense reserves were pre-positioned before the infrastructure collapsed. That water is finite. When it is consumed, nothing replaces it. The international humanitarian response, and it is being mobilized, operates on logistics timelines that the biological requirements of 9 million people do not accommodate. The ICRC, UNICEF, the WHO, the organizations with the capacity to deliver emergency water at scale move from crisis identification to operational capability in days, not hours, days, and that assumes functional logistics corridors. Israel does not have functional logistics corridors right now. Ben Gurion is destroyed. The alternative routing channels that replaced it are running at maximum military logistics capacity. Humanitarian supply competes for access in a conflict zone with a closed primary airport and secondary routes already saturated. The water trucking, the purification units, the distribution infrastructure that a humanitarian response requires does not arrive on the timeline that dehydration operates on. Those timelines are not compatible, And no amount of international mobilization changes the biological reality of what happens when a civilian population runs out of water. The hospitals deserve separate and specific attention because what is happening inside them right now is the most immediate life-threatening consequence of this strike, and it is being underreported. Israel's hospital system was already in a degraded state before this morning. Power grids were down, backup generators running. Water supply was already stressed from the earlier Mekarat infrastructure strikes. Surge capacity had been pushed to its limits by weeks of missile campaign casualties. The destruction of the last water treatment facility did not hit a hospital system operating from a position of strength. It hit a hospital system that was already bending under accumulated pressure and removed the one input, clean treated water at clinical purity standards, that cannot be substituted in a medical environment. Dialysis requires water meeting specific purity standards. There is no workaround for that requirement. Surgical sterilization requires water. Wound care at infection prevention standards requires water. The patients currently inside Israel's hospitals, the most medically vulnerable people in the country at the moment, it is under the most sustained attack in its history, are not facing reduced water access. They are facing water absence at the precise moment when the consequences of water absence in a clinical setting are measured not in discomfort but in mortality. And what has the Israeli government communicated to its civilian population about all of this? The same thing it has communicated about every previous infrastructure failure in this conflict. Nothing honest. The civil defense guidance telling civilians to maintain emergency water reserves was written for a situation where those reserves could be replenished from a functioning supply. It has not been updated. The civilians who consumed their reserves in the days after the earlier water infrastructure strikes, rationally expecting restoration on the timeline their government had been implying, have nothing left. The civilians who maintained their reserves are sitting on a finite quantity with no replenishment path and no honest government communication about what that means. Neither group has been told the honest answer to the question that matters, which is, when does the water come back? The honest answer is that it does not. Not from this infrastructure, not on any timeline that changes what happens to 9 million people operating on biological time. Stay with me, because the geopolitical dimension of Iran's weapon choice is where this strike's consequences extend far beyond Israel's borders. The choice of cluster munitions for this target is generating international legal and humanitarian consequences that a standard ballistic strike would not have produced. Cluster munitions carry specific restrictions under international humanitarian law. The Convention on Cluster Munitions prohibits their use by signatories. Iran is not a signatory. But the legal framework that governs attacks on objects indispensable to civilian survival, codified in Additional Protocol 1 of the Geneva Conventions, applies regardless of whether a nation has signed the Cluster Munitions Convention specifically. The ICRC has issued an emergency statement. The UN Secretary General has called for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. And the Allied governments that have been managing their domestic political support for Israel's right to self-defense throughout this conflict are now managing a fundamentally different public opinion environment than the one that existed yesterday morning. There is a specific reason why that political environment has shifted, and it has nothing to do with sympathy calculations or humanitarian sentiment in the abstract. Every previous Iranian strike that generated international response was framed around military and strategic targets. Power grids, communications infrastructure, logistics nodes, these are targets that governments defending Israel's right to respond to Iranian aggression could explain to their domestic publics in terms of military necessity and proportionality debates. Cluster missiles destroying the last water plant serving 4 million civilians is not a story that fits inside that framing. It does not matter how the strike is contextualized strategically. The image that lands in every Allied capital's domestic news cycle is not a military analysis graphic. It is the last water plant. And no Allied government has a domestic political framework that allows it to defend that image to its own population on the terms that previous strikes allowed. That political reality matters enormously for what comes next, because the American military withdrawal that preceded this strike was already the most consequential single shift in the strategic balance of this conflict. The presence that was sustaining Israel's operational capacity, the logistics, the intelligence integration, the deterrence signaling, is gone. What replaces it is a diplomatic and political framework being managed by governments whose domestic publics are now watching the last water plant burn. The leverage that framework provides is not the same leverage that military presence provided, and Iran understands that distinction precisely. What happens next changes the entire strategic situation, and you need to understand why before this analysis is complete. The Netanyahu government is not managing a military crisis anymore. It is managing a civilizational infrastructure collapse simultaneously across every system that modern urban life in a country of 9 million people requires to function. Power is gone. Water is gone. The primary airport is destroyed and not coming back on any relevant timeline. External military support has withdrawn. The Dimona facility has absorbed strikes whose damage has not been publicly disclosed. Tel Aviv has taken hypersonic missile impacts. And now the last water treatment facility has been destroyed with a weapon specifically chosen to make restoration impossible on the timeline that survival requires. Each of those events in isolation is a crisis. A military campaign absorbs crises, adapts, and continues. What Israel is managing is not a series of isolated crises. It is the simultaneous collapse of every infrastructure layer that a modern nation-state requires to sustain its civilian population. And those collapses are not independent of each other. They compound. A civilian population managing a power outage can cope if water remains functional. A civilian population managing a water shortage can cope if hospitals remain fully operational. A civilian population managing hospital degradation can cope if external logistics corridors remain open. Remove all of those simultaneously, and what you have is not a population managing multiple crises. You have a population whose every coping mechanism has been removed at the same time. That is what Iran has been systematically constructing through this campaign. Not battlefield victory in the conventional sense that military analysts measure with territory and force attrition. Strategic paralysis achieved through the simultaneous destruction of every infrastructure layer that a modern civilian population depends on to survive. And the cluster munition strike on the last water plant is not the beginning of that strategy. It is its completion. I have spent decades studying how military campaigns achieve strategic objectives, and I will tell you directly what the pattern of Iranian strikes in this conflict represents. This is not improvised escalation. This is not reactive targeting driven by battlefield developments. This is a systematically sequenced infrastructure destruction campaign executed against a target set that was mapped, prioritized, and sequenced before the first strike was fired. The Mekara water network was not struck randomly. It was struck node by node in a sequence designed to degrade redundancy before eliminating the last remaining capacity. The power grid was not struck uniformly. It was struck in a sequence designed to maximize cascading failure across dependent systems. The airport was not struck to disrupt military logistics alone. It was struck to close the logistics corridor that humanitarian response and external support depend on. Every strike in this campaign has been designed to remove one layer of resilience while leaving the civilian population dependent on the layers that have not yet been struck. The cluster munition strike on the last water plant removed the last layer. And now the question that every government watching this conflict must answer is not a military question. It is not a legal question. It is not even primarily a geopolitical question. It is a human question with a biological timeline attached to it. How long can a civilian population of 9 million people sustain itself without treated water, without reliable power, without functional hospital infrastructure, and without open logistics corridors through which external support can arrive at the scale required? The answer is measured in days, not weeks. Not the months that military campaigns are designed to operate across, days. And the government managing this situation in military and strategic timeframes is now governing a population operating on a biological clock that military decision-making was never designed to address. The Israeli government has an obligation it has not yet met, and that obligation is becoming more urgent with every hour that passes without honest communication. 9 million people are making survival decisions right now based on information their government has not provided them. The civilians who still have water reserves need to know those reserves are not going to be replenished, so they can make rational decisions about consumption. The civilians who have already exhausted their reserves need to know the honest answer about restoration timelines, so they can make rational decisions about whether to remain where they are. The hospitals need honest public acknowledgement of what the water absence means for clinical operations so that patients who can be moved to facilities with alternative resources can be moved before the window for doing so closes. A government that continues to manage civilian communication the way this one has, with silence, implication, and the maintenance of a false normalcy that the infrastructure facts do not support, is not protecting its population from panic. It is removing its population's ability to make the rational survival decisions that the situation demands. Iran destroyed the last water plant. The choice of weapon told you everything about the precision of their target intelligence and the permanence of their intent. The taps are dry, the clock is running, and the question that remains is whether the governments with the capacity to change what happens next will act on the timeline that 9 million people's survival requires, or on the timeline that politics, logistics, and institutional inertia allow. Those two timelines have never been further apart than they are right now, and the distance between them is being measured in human lives.